Hello and welcome to another episode of the Practitioner's Chair, a conversation series presented by Bridgepath Innovations, where we bring forth experiences and perspectives of leaders who have helped shape global capability centers from the inside. Today, in this episode, we move a step back from the day-to-day conversations about GCCs and explore the fundamental question around first principles. That is, what are the principles that determine whether a GCC becomes a true capability center or remains simply another delivery organization? To explore this question, I'm joined by Ramaswamy Narayanan, the CEO of Bridgepath Innovations today. Welcome, Ram.
Thank you, Tanu. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to this conversation.
Ram, I'd like to begin our conversation today by looking at your experience so far. So, if you were to look back at your journey across the GCC ecosystem, what experiences have had the biggest influence on how you think about global capability centers today?
I think that's a great question. So let me take a step back and think about, since you asked about a journey. So I've been very fortunate to have witnessed the GCC ecosystem as a GCC leader, as a service provider, as a CIO, and as a consulting and advisory firm, and as an author.
Okay.
So I think these multiple dimensions have given me very different perspectives that I've gleaned about the GCC ecosystem. So when I kind of think about it in terms of the journey, and if I were to map that journey across a little more than 2 decades, when GCCs came into existence in the beginning, it was all about cost, it was about talent, it was about productivity. And I think that's where it ended. Now, fast forward and look at the GCCs today, those first principles still matter. It is still about cost. It is still about talent. It is still about productivity. But what has also happened in the entire journey is this talent has shown enough potential in terms of being able to add a lot of value to the enterprise. And that comes with the understanding of the context, understanding the business, understanding why is it that we do what we do. I think that's kind of shifted the needle of saying, well, the cost, the talent, and the productivity are now table stakes. So when you think about a GCC today, it's these three plus your ability to actually add value to the enterprise because you are an employee of that enterprise. Now, if I were to kind of, take an example, let's say there are 2 GCCs that have the same starting point. They are set up in the best and the choicest of locations. They have access to a great talent pool that is a function of that particular location. When you go back and look at the journey of those 2 GCCs, let's say in 3 to 5 years, one will be immensely successful, one may not be. So then the question is that if all the basic ingredients that are being considered today in terms of a setup are yielding 2 different results, why is that? I think the key reason for the success of one and the not so much of a great success of the other lies in the key question of why was this GCC set up?
Right.
What was it meant to accomplish for the enterprise? And what is the level of sponsorship that it received from the enterprise in its journey?
Okay.
So when I think about the GCC and the traversing of the journey, I've been part of many GCCs myself. And I can say that not all those have been very successful runs. Some have been, some have not. So what's the difference? The ones that have been successful had a very clear intent. The intent was that this is something that we want to set up in India because we want to drive ownership of certain core capabilities that we consider essential to the enterprise, followed by the willingness of the enterprise to relinquish a certain degree of control. And third is to also allow the amplitude of innovation and ideation while the table stakes of cost, talent, and productivity were kept in place. So if I kind of look at it, the GCC is no longer just an operating model. It is actually an enterprise decision to create capability in a certain location that's core and essential to the enterprise. So that's how I look at the entire traversing of the journey.
That's a really interesting perspective, given that throughout your journey, you've observed that GCCs fail when they just remain an operating model and they don't move beyond that to become a capability platform for the enterprise itself. So I think this forms a natural bridge to the next question that I intend to ask you today. One idea that comes through very clearly in your book, Why Global Capability Centers Fail, is that GCCs often don't fail because of execution, but they fail because of the thinking at the very beginning, which is flawed. So, in your experience, what are some of the most common first principles that an organization overlooks when they build or transform a GCC?
So let me start by saying that a GCC does not fail in year 3 or year 5.
Right.
A GCC fails at the stage of the PowerPoint. And what do I mean by that? I think when you look at when enterprises are approaching the GCC, the framing of the question as to why do I need a GCC is the most critical element that's going to determine the success or the failure of the model.
Right.
Many organizations, even today, ask the question, is a GCC a cheaper option? And we see that all the time. Now, if you go back and reflect on the first response where I talked about cost, talent, and productivity, that does not mean that those become the common denominators in terms of approaching the GCC. So to me, that's flawed. Rather, the question needs to be, what is it that is so critical as a capability to the enterprise that I would want to have absolute control, that I would put in a location so that I create concentration of capability in specific chosen areas? I think that's the first fundamental flaw in the approach. Now, when you think about it today, there's no dearth of announcements where we see organizations coming and saying, we're going to create a 2,000 people center over 3 years, or 1,500 or 5,000. Some of these thousands, it has a lot of headline news, captures a lot of eyeballs and attention. But when you kind of approach a center with saying, I'm going to create a center with X number of people, you're creating a center of capacity and not specific capability. So when you think about it in terms of capability, the number is only consequential in terms of how many people do you really need in order to drive that particular capability. So you can have a lot of people, but you may not have enough output and outcome that influences the enterprise in terms of its business and results. That's a capacity center, not a capability center. Now, when you go to the next one, there's this very important thing that comes up every time: leadership, global roles, seat at the table. All that fundamentally boils down to what is that leadership that you are going to create at the center. More importantly, how much you're going to empower that leadership to make the right decisions for unlocking that capability to the enterprise. I think a lot of issues that we see is people appoint the right folks. Usually what I say is 8, 9, 10 rounds of interviews, and eventually convert them into a staffing and administrative function of the center, not really in terms of impact to the enterprise. And the fourth and final thing that I would want to talk about really is that people think of design of a center as a waste of time.
Okay.
Because when you think about it, I think there's a lot of people that would want to rush you into saying that location, all of the above that I talked about. If you have that figured out, you're ready to go plonk a GCC. And way too often, what I observe is companies start their GCC and then try to figure out a design and a model. I think that's getting the whole organizational structure backwards. So when you kind of think about these, I would say these are the 4 fundamental large mistakes that an enterprise sort of rushes into a GCC model without any forethought.
Right. That's a unique way of looking at this whole GCC construct, because it's shifting the conversation from how to build a GCC to why must you consider the GCC construct in the first place. But given this, we all must acknowledge the fact that today GCCs are operating in a very complex environment to what they were probably a decade or 2 decades ago. So that brings me to my next question. Organizations today are building GCCs in a very different environment. There are several forces that are converging along the GCC construct. Some to name would be geopolitics, AI, regulations, technological advancements, etc. And these are all influencing enterprise decisions. So, from a first principles perspective, again, how should leaders think about what the role of a GCC is in this broader context of a VUCA environment, a volatile, uncertain, complicated, and an ambiguous environment, especially if they're starting the journey of considering a global capability center today?
So, if you reflect back in terms of what I said about the GCC journey, a lot of what decisions were driving the GCC was how can we optimize delivery at a reasonable cost at a location that is talent rich. And that was enough as questions. But if you think about how you described the current environment that we are in, I think it opens a lot more questions. These three are still fundamental. But on top of that, I would also layer that enterprises themselves are operating in that world of uncertainty.
Yes.
That means merely optimizing for that cost, talent, and productivity is not going to be sufficient. Because you want to be able to create an engine that's going to help you boost and bolster your own value to your customers in whatever business that you want to be in. The second is, if you think about 10, 15 years ago, technology was something that was kind of a bolt on to running the business. So you had the business and then you had technology kind of boosting the business. Today, when you think about it, technology is sort of intermingled. In fact, it is in some cases the business. So which means you cannot extract the two and look at, I'm going to focus on my business and do something on the side.
Right.
Because what you do here is going to have a direct impact and a consequence in terms of business outcomes. Right? Now, when you talk about the forces, you're absolutely right. When you talk about geopolitics, you're talking about AI, you're talking about regulations, you're talking about a lot of things that have changed and changed so rapidly and will continue to change.
True.
Which means when you think about a GCC construct, it's less about rigidity. It's less about, hey, it worked, I'm going to take something that's working and I'm going to shift it here and I expect it to work. You want to build a construct that's resilient and quickly adaptable to change.
Right.
So which means it's not a static organization. And why I bring that up is a lot of GCCs that were set up on a blueprint 5 years ago have never gone back and revisited that blueprint.
Right.
In the context of what it is to conduct business as an enterprise and for the capability center to stand the test of, is it truly adding value to the enterprise in terms of that capability. Now, I want to kind of bring four lenses when you talk about, how do you kind of look at it in this uncertain world. We hear AI sovereignty. I want to bring in something called capability sovereignty. What does that mean? So capability sovereignty is the decision of an enterprise in terms of what are those absolutely essential capabilities that are extremely needed for me to be successful. Core. Something that I wouldn't trust to a third party because that's something that is so internal to my enterprise. Right? The second thing I want to bring about is knowledge. And when I say knowledge, it's not about knowledge in the sense of knowing about the systems and the technology. This is knowledge about the enterprise. And also in terms of the capability, where I talked about capability is the core central theme of a GCC, which means how are you creating advancing knowledge of the enterprise with a relentless focus on improving the capability towards enterprise transformation.
Right.
The third thing I want to bring in is control and compliance. So when you talked about, let's say, compliance, about, 10, 12 months ago to compliance today, given everything else that you described in terms of the changing world, I think the rigor of compliance has only increased.
Yes.
Which means you're also having to keep in mind that the structure is amenable to make sure that it can cater to an increasing set of compliances that are kind of watching over the business world as well as the capability centers. The fourth one is enterprise agility. I think this boils down to, can the enterprise really reconfigure quickly? And I don't mean by reconfiguration only about the GCC. It's about, can it reconfigure itself from an enterprise headquarters and the fabric of the enterprise and the GCC so that it remains in tandem. So again, the last thing I would say is, the GCC that cannot adapt and readjust itself to the changing world, the changing factors that govern the geopolitical, technology, and a whole bunch of things that are happening around it at a rapid pace, I think you're setting the GCC up to fail, eventually not adding a lot of value to the enterprise.
Right. So I think the key takeaway from your response is that static GCCs are not going to be able to survive in this VUCA world, and that dynamism, resilience, and adaptivity is going to be a cornerstone of success for global capability centers today.
Right.
So we've looked at global capability centers today and what they must consider if they think of adapting and utilizing this construct of a global capability centers. I think it's natural that we look ahead and see what the picture is going to be like in the future. So looking ahead to say 2030, what will be the role of GCCs? It is surely true that global capability centers and their roles will continue to evolve. And from a first principles perspective, again, what do you believe will be even more important when these organizations begin to adapt global capability centers in the future? And are there some things that they can possibly do today to be successful in 2030?
That's a good question. And we're talking about the looking glass, really. We're in 2026. So 2030 is not that far away.
It is not.
So when you think about 2030 and the GCCs, my take is the GCCs are going to look radically different. What do I mean by that? The first one is it's going to move from scale to specialization. That's a first shift. It's no longer about headcount. It's about specific capability, which we have talked about. We're also going to talk about a change in the way GCCs are measured from the metric of measurement. I think today, of course, we talk about business value and business outcomes and things like that. But I would argue that there are very few GCCs that actually are able to tie their outcomes directly to business outcomes. And in the future, we will see that a lot more GCCs will strive and should be connecting their work directly to business outcomes. And everything else that is used to measure, it's more of operational efficiency and hygiene of the GCC, not really something that you kind of report out on. Now, AI, we've talked a lot about AI, and no conversation is complete without AI. But the one thing that we need to keep in mind is AI is such a disruptive force that, yes, you have camps that are naysayers and people are very gung-ho, but I think over a period of time, by 2030, this is just going to become staple. Which means if that's going to be the staple, how are you really re-architecting yourself as a GCC? When I said, remember, it's not about scale, it's about specialization.
Right.
So that's the first. The second shift is moving from an execution hub to an intelligence hub. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of jargons or terms here, but why intelligence hub? At the end of the day, when you build capability, that capability is going to turn a lot of outcomes for the business by driving intelligence out of that work.
Right.
Intelligence either in getting the work done efficiently, intelligence in terms of how enterprises make decisions, which means it's no longer about, how many tickets did you solve and the rudimentary metrics. And like I said, that's important, but that's hygiene. The third, I think, is the movement from the services mindset into what I call as the business ownership mindset. Now, today, when you think about it, and I obviously participate in a lot of discussions where A GCC is still considered to be an internal service provider.
Right.
Now, that is true. That may be the nature of the construct. But you can't hold, and if you continue to hold the GCC to the service provider metric, you're really losing out on the innovation and the transformative nature of this construct. So that means everything will now shift towards business ownership. Remember, I said your outcome of the GCC is tied to business outcome. So therefore, that becomes the metric of the GCC by and large, and that of the leadership at the GCC. So when you think about what are those first principles that is going to drive clarity in 2030, one is purpose in the changing context and being very clear, which means refreshing and coming back to the congruence of the GCC to the enterprise. That needs to be done periodically. The second is about the talent architecture. I think there's this whole Marshall Goldsmith's thing about what got you here won't get you there.
Yes.
I think that principle is true, and even more that what got you here in terms of a GCC is going to rapidly be undone, and we'll have to go through a major change by 2030. And enterprises and GCC leadership that can move fast with that rapid pace of change are the ones that's going to really survive and thrive. We already talked about operating flexibility. That means the rules are being redrawn. By 2030, I think the concept of capability centers will diminish. It will become orchestrated centers of capability. That means companies are going to kind of look at it in terms of having multiple spots around the world that's going to come together in order to be able to solve a problem. Now, in that context, certain locations and certain hubs are going to become the concentration of that enterprise capability. So it's not about I want to be in the middle of everything. And the last one, of course, is leadership influence. I cannot but emphasize that the leaders need to be business savvy. They need to be enterprise savvy. It's about how can I influence business outcomes through the construct and not become the shepherd of the construct. So what leaders must do now, I think with a heightened sense of urgency, is reevaluate the GCC portfolio.
Okay.
And why I say that is there are GCCs that in the last 5 years may have accumulated a lot of activities within the center that no longer fit the purpose of the center, which means you need to be able to reassess the capability and actually let go of ones that don't make sense. That doesn't mean just kind of, let go and not do anything about it. Look at alternate mechanisms where it can be better done efficiently by partners, third party, whatever else. You own the outcome of getting it done as opposed to sitting and doing it.
Right.
Redesign talent for AI. I think this is something that we hear a lot of people being put through AI courses. There are companies that have invested in throes of Copilot and Cloud licenses and what have you. I wouldn't say it's wasted, but then be a little bit more intentional because, like I said, AI is a sweeping change, which is going to be the staple by 2030. So how are you kind of thinking about it? And finally, I would say upgrade your leadership expectations. What do I mean by that? A GCC is not something that you govern and control. A GCC is something that you evolve, nurture, and transform. So if you know that it's going to become a continuous living thing within the enterprise and the organization, I think that's going to be crucial in terms of GCCs of 2030 and beyond.
Right. I think the picture that you've painted and visualized how radically different global capability centers are going to look in 2030 would definitely have given some food for thought for all the listeners and the leaders out there who aim to build dynamic global capability centers that will thrive and will not suffer, though there are several changes that, as you pointed out, are expected to happen. So before we wrap up this episode of the Practitioner's Chair, what are the key takeaways that you would say listeners to this episode should carry with them?
It's a very difficult thing because when you think about what do I want to share, I have a book, okay, which means there's a lot. There's no one dimension. But for the purpose of this conversation, let me say, I want to leave the leaders with 5 thoughts. The first one, GCCs are structural changes to an enterprise. The GCC is not a trend that you chase. Now, following that, I also say that, today, everybody talks about GCC, and I get this impression that the GCC is a very over romanticized model. Not every company, and this is going to be controversial, I think, for a lot of people. I believe not every enterprise needs a GCC. And it's okay for enterprises not to have one if there is no compelling need to have one. But having said that, I think it's also a structure that every enterprise must evaluate to decide whether that makes sense for them or not, because there are forces that are forcing enterprises to kind of look at it through that concentration of enterprise knowledge, capability, and therefore impact. Now, when I say that, today I think it's all about, hey, have you tried a GCC? Maybe you should try that. That's like a hammer looking for every problem that looks like a nail. I think resist that temptation. The third one I would say is avoid short-term thinking. Even today, when I sit and listen to a lot of folks, and some of the folks that we work with as well, the instinct is always to say that I want to set up a GCC, and then you see this giant spreadsheets that get churned out someplace. You will see vendors, contractors, and there's an hourly rate, and then there's one structure and says, okay, this looks great, let's go do this. Needs to be done because you're kind of looking at it in terms of investment and ROI, without which there is no business case. But then looking at it just through that lens is like you're taking work from one, putting it into a different location. You will see short term that cost run, but if you're not looking at it through that lens of progressive capability, I think that cost curve is going to grow on you in such a way that you'll be looking for a different location or a different kind of a place to go put all of this work in. Now, the fourth one that I want to leave with is the leadership model and the leadership itself. Now, I don't want to go through the entire run of this, too much of discussions and rhetoric in the leadership. I will only say this: a very average GCC model with an exceptional leadership team drives far greater results than an exceptional GCC model with weak leadership. So I think that's something that you cannot afford to ignore. Mm-hmm. And the final thing I would say is, what is the true success of a GCC metric? It's not the rudimentary operational metric. It's about, has this GCC, the capability that we have created, helped actually influence and change business outcomes? And if that's a metric that you are unable to tie through the construct, I think it's a service delivery unit that will last a certain life for a certain purpose, will start becoming irrelevant very quickly.
Right. Thank you so much, Ram, for sharing your insights and taking the time out to be a part of the Practitioner's Chair. I think this episode would have definitely left the audience with a deeper understanding of whether the GCC construct is really for them, and if it is, then how must they go about building the Global Capability Center, and what are some pertinent questions that they must answer before entering into that construct. Thank you so much, Ram.
Thank you, Tanu. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. For the audience who's tuned into the Practitioner's Chair, thank you so much for your time. I hope this session has been useful and you walk away with better understanding of global capability centers. Please stay tuned for further practitioner-led discussions on the Practitioner's Chair. This is Tanushree Nagaveni signing off. Thank you.